Brilliant. So first of all, welcome to everybody who's come on today. I am Sharon Livermore, Director of Cameo Recruitment in Cambridge, and wanted to explain a little bit about why we're facilitating today's session. So I am a business owner of a small business, and the cost of living crisis is something that has been on our radars, for quite a while. But I think we're now in that position as business owners or people that work in the world of business where we're seeing the impact. So for me, it's a case of wanting to keep my employees happy as much as I can, understanding that they have needs and different scenarios, shall we say, that I have to work with. But at the same time, I need to keep the business moving forward and make sure that we're protecting as much as we can to navigate through this period. And obviously working in recruitment, it does have an impact. So I really wanted to put on a session today with people, experts, shall we say, in their fields that we're listening to today, just so that anyone on here can learn a little bit more, understand the current climate that we're in, and hopefully gain some tips that will help them move forwards and make those decisions that help them get through the next weeks, months or years, who knows. So I would like to first of all hand over to Lydia from Rollings Accounts. So I'm just going to hand over to her now. Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning everyone. I'm Lydia from Rollings Accounts, small business accountant with 4 in 5 business owners worried about the cost of living. I felt that I could hopefully just offer some general tips that may help small business owners, but also to consider the impact that the cost of living is having on the employee and the general world that we're in at the moment, which obviously isn't the pleasant world we'd like to be in, I believe. I've got 4 in 5 business owners worried about how the cost of living is going to affect their business, how it is already impacting the business, and 2 in 3 business owners are actually awake at night worrying about these things. So I think most of us can agree that actually a spring clean is always a good thing to do. So it doesn't mean a spring clean of your house, but you can have a financial spring clean. So one of the things we're doing with a lot of our clients at the moment is looking at contracts that they have. Do they need those contracts? Does it add value? If it doesn't, can we terminate the contract? Is there a cost to doing so? Do they need that subscription? Are we paying for a subscription that isn't adding value, that isn't no longer needed? Or are we utilising software to its fullest extent? So is there software that we're using, but we could automate processes a little bit more to streamline things, to be more effective? So there's a lot of software out there, we all know, but as an accountant, there's small business software that can enhance our procedures, our timekeeping and things like that. Really, it's a matter of, are they needed? Do they add value? Also, for terms of cash flow, I know cash is king. It's the famous words of everywhere when it comes to business. Can we look at things like invoice financing? Is it worth that? Depending on the structure of the business, would that help? A massive thing that's, I think, very important for any small business is a budget. Get a budget. Yes, it's very difficult in uncertain times to predict what's going to happen. Put yourself a budget for the next 12 months and then an extended budget for the 12 after. Things will change. They will never always stick to it, but try to stick to these and cut costs where you can. Just look for alternative suppliers. And also things, and this is very simple, is there a way, I know many places are now paperless, but could we turn a company to a paperless situation? Okay, printing doesn't cost a fortune, but every little helps in terms of cutting costs. I've said a lot. I'm really sorry about that, guys. Also, expand your network. Are there places you could go to that is free for networking with other businesses? Could you help another small business? Are there ways that your connections could work to improve profitability and things like that? And then I think with our focus on the employee side, can we save money on travel? Can they travel together? Actually, not only is that better for the environment and cost effective, but it might actually be better for people's well-being. Traveling in a car, you can talk things over. it might be a good start to a day. So again, maybe we suggest a little financial spring clean for our employees. Are they able to have a nice meal out? Because potentially they could, swap up their Tesco vouchers. I know it's a very silly thing, really, and a lot of the steps that I've spoken about are very simple things, and I'm sure everybody has these in practice. But sometimes it's the simple procedures that need sort of focusing to help the bigger decisions. Again, with employees, keep them talking. If they've got a problem, it's lovely. I'm fortunate enough to have worked with Sharon, where consideration for employees is very important. And I think this is a step that, as an employer, if we can give them some tips, this is something we should probably perhaps do. Maybe if they've got a credit card and it's got balance on, would they switch it to a 0% credit card for, to help them ease over this period? And keep talking. A problem shared is a problem halved, and planning it is absolutely key. A cash flow forecast to assist with any. You can have a household cash flow forecast as you can a small business one. So again, it's something that can be suggested to employees. I think I've talked so quickly that I've probably covered a lot of what I wanted to say. And I think I'm handing over to Soraya. So I'm going to do that if that's okay. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Lydia. Morning, everyone. Thank you for having me, Sharon, and asking me to be part of this webinar this morning. So, excuse me, what I wanted to talk about this morning is what maybe employers can do to support their employees, and that will segue nicely into what my colleague Rachel's going to speak about, and then obviously the team at Mercer as well. So I'm not going to, hopefully won't overlap too much, but the focus for what I wanted to speak about was mainly around good leadership and good communication in these challenging times. So I think as leaders of businesses, we have the weight of the world on our shoulders. We're making tough decisions, and sometimes we don't know, what to do, and our employees are looking to us for leadership and to give direction and clarity when there's a lot of ambiguity going on. So I think as leaders, what we want to be doing is thinking about what our clear communication strategy is in terms of how we're supporting and signposting our employees. I think getting feedback from the employees about where they may be wanting help and support is really important, and that way you can then signpost them to trusted advisors, your HR teams, or your external HR support, whoever that may be, in terms of, benefits support, understanding that financial education, and understanding actually how you can maximise your benefits, which I know Chris and Ben will go on to talk about in a bit more detail. But it's really important that you have a clear communication strategy, you're getting feedback from the organisation, but most importantly, it's about really being visible to people, because it's so hard when you're probably making sort of a lot of phone calls, you're talking about financing, you're working away in the background to steady the ship, but actually what employees want to see is that you're kind of in there with them, and that visibility and regular communication is really, really important. So what I would suggest is you take the opportunity to maybe work with your HR teams again, or your people specialists, maybe get some feedback from the organisation. Think about maybe doing a survey. It doesn't have to be a big 60-question survey, maybe just some really key questions around what they'd like more information on. Do they understand the benefits in the organisation? What might be impacting their well-being? And once you get that feedback, that should also give you a great framework in terms of thinking about how we communicate, where we signpost, and what additional support we put in place. As Lydia mentioned, there's lots of things that you can do that can become cost efficient without adding to more additional costs to your business, which is more, really important. And you want to be working with your advisors around that, your accountants, your legal advisors, your HR support again. But it's really important that, as leaders, you're making sure you utilize your advisors, and making the most of the networks that you have, as Lydia said as well, because sometimes it's really hard if you're a standalone leader to have that support. You can feel quite isolated, and I think it's really, really important to maximise that support that you have, because you're going through the same thing as your employees. But like I said before, they're looking to you for that leadership in times of uncertainty. And I think, as Rachel will go on to explain, there may be times when you have to make difficult decisions around your workforce, and Rachel can expand on that a bit more. So it's probably more appropriate that I hand over to Rachel now, because I know that we didn't want to overlap too much, and Chris and Ben, as I said, will talk more about the signposting around utilising what benefits you already have in place. Over to you, Rachel.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Soraya. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Rachel Ashwood, and I'm an employment lawyer at Taylor Vinters, working alongside Soraya. What I'm going to look at for the next 10 minutes or so are some of the options that a business has where it's identified that it needs to reduce costs, but also identified that, unfortunately, this cost-cutting exercise is going to have to involve making some cuts to its staffing costs. Now, you may well be thinking that this means that for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to be talking about redundancies. In fact, I'm going to try and do my best to avoid talking about that dreaded R word. Instead, I'm going to focus on other options that may be available to an employer, which will enable them to retain their current employees whilst at the same time reducing costs. And what I'm going to do is just outline at quite a high level 3 options that employers may wish to consider if they find themselves in this really tricky situation. So the first option for employers could potentially be to ask staff if there's anyone that is interested in volunteering to change or reduce their working hours or commitment to the business in the short term, and take, I suppose, an associated pay cut that comes with that. And you may well be thinking, who would possibly come forward and volunteer to reduce their hours or reduce their pay? But whilst I was thinking about this, I thought, well, maybe there is someone in the workforce that currently works full time. They've not been brave enough, perhaps, to put in a statutory flexible working request to reduce their hours beforehand. But actually now they've been given the opportunity to volunteer to reduce their time commitment, perhaps to 3 or 4 days a week, and trial that in the short term. Equally, maybe there's someone in the workforce that's got a burning desire to do an extended period of travel for 3 months, but they've always felt constrained by their normal annual leave entitlement, so haven't thought about suggesting it. But all of a sudden, they've got an opportunity to perhaps take an extended period of unpaid leave. So you never know what sort of requests may come out of that kind of exercise. If an employer is keen to explore this option with staff, I think my recommendation would be that they explain the option to all staff and the reasons for this. And this comes down to Soraya's point about it's all about communicating with the workforce. They should then ask if there is anyone who's potentially interested in this. They should ask them to set out their request in writing for the company to consider. Now, it's of course not going to be possible, or probably not going to be possible, for the employer to accommodate all requests. Let's say everyone decides they like this idea of a 3-month period of extended unpaid leave. Well, clearly a business can't accommodate that. It still needs to function. But it's equally likely that there will be some requests that it can accommodate, even just for a short period of time. And if it can do that, then it's a win for the employer, who gets to save some costs in the short term. But it's also a win for the employee, who has been enabled to change their working pattern in a way that they have requested. I think it's probably also a win for the employee's colleagues as well, who are able to continue with their current working arrangements without feeling that their own role is at risk of redundancy or jeopardised at this moment in time. So that's the first option. I think the second option for an employer to consider is whether there are any individuals amongst its current workforce who are not employees. So here I'm talking about any perhaps independent contractors or consultants who provide their services on a self-employed basis, or indeed whether there are any agency staff that are currently on the company's books. And the reason I mention this is that as a general principle, it's far easier and often less costly and quicker for a company to terminate its arrangements with these non-employees than it is to terminate any employment contracts. And as such, it's always worth thinking about what can be done to reduce the supply of labour from independent contractors or agency staff before taking any more drastic measures in connection with employees. So option 2, I say, think about any non-employees and whether those costs can be reduced before moving on to taking any more drastic measures in connection with employees. The third option that I want to touch upon this morning is whether it would be appropriate for the employer to introduce perhaps more permanent changes to an employee's pay packet. And this is never going to go down well. And again, it comes back to Soraya's point that it's all about how you communicate this. And this is similar to option 1. With option 1, we were asking for employees to come forward and suggest what their varied work arrangements might look like. Here, we're looking at it from the flip side. And so we're looking at it from the employer's position, where it has had to make that difficult decision that perhaps as a precursor to making any redundancies, that it's possible to retain its current headcount if, for example, they were all prepared to take a salary cut. And this is actually something that we discussed with a lot of employers in the early stages of the pandemic, particularly before the furlough scheme was introduced. Now, the legal issue here is that unless the employment contract allows the employer to reduce pay, then the change can generally only be made if the employee consents to the change. And it's really interesting that when I was having these conversations with employers at the start of the pandemic, I was a little bit sceptical that employees would agree or be amenable to these kind of changes, but was really surprised how many people did agree to a salary cut. I'm not sure, with things as tight as they are now for so many people, that consent would be as easy to secure from employees, but that should certainly be the first way to try and implement pay cuts. With that in mind, where consent cannot be obtained, then it's not the end of the road for an employer, and it does still have a couple of options. It could take a very risky approach and try and impose changes to pay unilaterally, just push them through. But I say that does come with a high degree of legal risk, not least that's very likely to be a breach of contract. Secondly, the company could consider the pay cut. It could decide that it's still appropriate to push it through, and it would do this by consulting fully with staff about what they're proposing to do, and there are certain time limits that may apply to this. And if it's still at the end of that consultation period decides that it's appropriate to put the pay cut through, which largely means that it's got a good sound business rationale for doing that, then it can embark upon a procedure which is known as dismissal and re-engagement, or fire and rehire as it's more commonly known in the press. And this essentially means that the employer can serve notice to terminate the employee's current employment contract on the higher salary, and at the same time offer them a new employment contract on the lower salary. It's not the most straightforward of processes. It is possible, and we would advise anyone seeks legal advice if they're looking to go down that route. So I've talked about 3 ways that an employer can manage its existing workforce in a difficult economic climate. And I'm very pleased to say that not one of those ways touched upon making redundancies, which of course would be probably worth a seminar in its own right. What I'm now going to do is hand over to Jeremy Reeve, who I think is going to be talking about tackling mental health support for directors and employees.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel, and that was a very interesting part of the presentation, so thank you for being so thorough. So mental health in business is something that affects almost everybody. In fact, mental health affects everybody, doesn't it? We all have some kind of mental health, whether it be positive or negative, but it's worth remembering that businesses have a legal obligation to make sure the workplace is safe, and that indeed includes mental health of employees. I'm going to put in the chat in a little bit a few sources of information, but it's always worth looking on the ACAS website, which is acas.org.uk, where there is some tips about workplace wellbeing and indeed some more about your obligations there. Supporting your team. So my top tips for supporting the team include open communication. So it doesn't matter how large your team is. If you're in a smaller business with maybe 10 or so employees, you're unlikely to have an HR in-house person. So it's your responsibility as a director of the business to manage this yourself. So I would suggest talking to your employees. The caveat around that is make sure it's private and confidential, and just having a brief chat with an employee. How are things? How are you coping? And we've heard that from some of the speakers earlier. Listen sounds really, the most obvious thing, but listen to what they say and then act. The law does state that you've got to make some reasonable adjustments. So again, we've heard that if somebody wants to go on to shorter working hours, or if there's a problem with a partner not being able to collect the children from school, show some reasonable adjustments. But also to signpost people. So if one of your employees says, I'm really, really struggling with the cost of living, I'm really struggling with my mental health, then look at where you can signpost them to. Workplace Wellbeing Hub, which is provided by Cambridgeshire Chaplaincy Service, is again a really good tool to use. It's something you can Google and find them. I work quite closely with Alistair, who heads up the organisation, where they'll send a chaplain into a workplace to deal with these issues. And it's somebody that is there to act as a soundboard to be spoken to. Then I'd suggest looking at perhaps getting some additional training for the business owner or the directors around mental health awareness. The FSB offers mental health awareness certification, also mental health first aid certification that we can offer you. Look at perhaps grief and bereavement awareness certification as well. So you've got the skills of listening and the skills of what you should do. And often it is just that listening ear and the employee knowing that somebody cares about them is good. And a reminder that in a small business, of course, is that it's more of a family environment because you work with these people and you build the relationships. But mental health awareness and activity for the director, I think, is really important. And one of the top tips that I'd give anybody that is in business is take time for yourself. As a business owner running a business, you're wearing lots of different hats, aren't you? And you're running around like a headless chicken some days. And I would absolutely book time into your calendar where it is just 10 minutes or 15 minutes and just close the laptop, turn off your mobile phone and just walk around the block if you're working from home, or just go and get some fresh air. Even make yourself a cup of coffee and just stand outside and just give yourself that 15 minutes, even once or twice a day. Just block that out of your calendar to give you a chance to rest. It will allow you to think, it will allow you to have some precious time away from the screen and just to reset yourself. Be kind to yourself. Again, with the stress of running a business at the best of times, it's hard enough, but with the cost of living crisis and all the issues that are going on in businesses at the moment, look after yourself. If you're in that real negative headspace, one of those days where everything that could go wrong goes wrong, there's no shame in saying, I'm going to take the afternoon off. It's not about burying your head in the sand. You're not walking away from your problems. But if you're having one of those bad days, to do a reset and focus on you will allow you to come back into the business on the next working day with a fresh pair of eyes. And some of those problems won't seem anywhere near as bad. Support for you as a business. So, this is not a sales pitch for the FSB, but one of the things that we offer our members is FSB Care. And FSP Care is a way that any of our members can pick up the phone and speak to our care team, where we have qualified mental health nurses there to talk to you about stress, to talk to you about how you can manage that. So I always direct our members there, but there's also some tools on a website for non-members. So really the top tips, and just to summarize from me, is to talk to your employees, ask them how they're doing, and stimulate the conversation. And from that, to signpost to other organizations if you can't deal with those issues yourself. But what you might find is that when you speak to an employee and you show that caring ear, that a problem shared is a problem halved, and it's often that your opinions can really help some of your employees move forward. But really, I will end my part of the session by saying absolutely self-care. Just try that 5 to 10 minutes in your diary twice a day if you can, of just stepping away from the phone, stepping away from the laptop, and just having some fresh air and look after yourself. I'm going to pop into the chat some sources of help for you. There's just 3 websites that are worth looking at. I'd like to thank you for listening. I'm now going to hand over to Ben.
Thank you, Jeremy, and yeah, good morning, everybody, and thanks for having us again. What I'm going to first talk about today is, I guess, how we at Mercer manage and implement employee benefit schemes to, I guess, negate the cost of living crisis, but both on the employer and the employee side. So I think that's a really important aspect, and it'll kind of interlink a little bit with what Soraya was talking about earlier around the communication piece. But I think what's the really important thing to think about from our side of things is that whilst we think employee benefits is important to provide that duty of care to employees from an employer perspective, you know, to get people back to work, to get families looked after, to improve people's mental health, it is also very much from that presenteeism side of things a very salient topic, because at the end of the day, as we're seeing within small SME businesses and corporate businesses, family-run businesses, for example, if people are off sick, if we've got key salespeople off sick for longer than they should be, if, you know, we've all seen the pressures with the NHS, if they can't get through, you know, referrals, and they can't get treatment that they need, then they could be off for longer than needed. And if, like I said, those key salespeople are off for longer than they should be, then we really, you know, that is to the detriment of these businesses. So I think that's kind of what we look to do, is we look to implement benefit and reward strategies and packages that help kind of prevent this and prevent it being extended for longer than it should. But what I really wanted to touch on was a few examples really around how the benefits and how the communication of the benefits is really important to maximizing that ROI for the business owners and for the employees receiving it. Because as business owners, you want to be receiving or getting, you know, as much ROI on every single penny and pound that you spend on the benefit. And I think from, you know, our research and what we do with clients, a lot of the time, you know, a vast majority of the workforce probably aren't aware of, you know, the scale of what is available to them at a very, you know, free of charge, low cost benefit that has been provided to them by the employers. So one really great example, I think, is taking into consideration a simple death in service scheme with a provider called Canada Life. And Canada Life kind of have a vast share of the market. They're one of the top insurers. And I think when we think of death in service, we think of a very vanilla, straightforward product. It is, you know, kind of does what it says on the tin, to be frank. But what comes with Canada Life's death in service product is a proposition called We Care, which is completely free of charge for all insured and uninsured employees. So even if you insure, say, you know, your 5 directors and you've got another 50 employees, all employees have access to this product. And it's an incredibly valuable tool across, you know, all spectrums of mental, financial, physical well-being. So, you know, you've got virtual GP services that are included, which can, you know, help you get that GP referral that you've been waiting for, you know, from your local practice. You've got financial guidance, which can give, you know, debt management and support like that. You've got counselling support as well included within that, smoking cessation work, diet and lifestyle kind of treatment as well. So I think all of these kind of topics are all interlinked with kind of how we are as people and how kind of mentally and financially or how good our well-being is in that sphere. And I think a lot of the times these benefits aren't utilized enough. And, you know, as I said, employers really want to get that ROI. Another really nice kind of idea, I think, really is looking at current climate and where we are currently, you know, with, say, interest rates rising. It's adapting kind of benefit and reward strategies to fit with what is going on in the world. So, for example, you can implement very, very cheap mortgage service benefits, which is basically, you know, a free of charge mortgage advice service for employees. They log onto a portal and you can get one-to-one webinars, sessions, workshops with mortgage advisors who, at the end of the day, you know, if they sell a mortgage to an employee, would just take a commission like any other mortgage broker would. So that's kind of a really nice, unique kind of benefit that, you know, with interest rates rising, people coming to the end of fixed rate mortgages, I think is a really important thing to think about, and to be really flexible in our approach to benefit and reward, because we've got to think about employees from all spectrums of life and also what is going on in the world right now. So that's kind of what I wanted to kind of portray, really, was just talk about how we sit on both sides of the spectrum and how we work with employers and employees to provide the packages that supports both sides of that, the employees and the employers, and just really to demonstrate, to really maximize that ROI on your benefits and how important that is. I will now pass on to Chris, who's the other part of the Mercer talk, who's going to talk about financial education.
Thank you, Ben. So good morning, everybody. So as Ben sort of touched upon, a number of different aspects of kind of how, from an employer's perspective, you can support your employees. My area of focus very much within MMB and Mercer is what we call financial education. So as a team, we're a specialist team within the business. And what we do is deliver guidance and education sessions from a financial perspective, both to groups of individuals and to individuals on a one-to-one sort of basis, from a sort of almost like a coaching kind of perspective. It's interesting, much of what's been said this morning, I'm going to touch upon as well. But I think one thing that sort of stands out to me, and I've seen over the years, is that if we were having this conversation maybe 5 years ago, even setting aside the cost of living sort of challenges, the focus, I think, as Jeremy talked about, would very much have been around kind of supporting employees from a mental health perspective and the importance of that. And obviously what we find now, and I find when I talk to most employers, regardless of size, they have in place pretty much, you know, robust kind of processes and procedures around supporting people's kind of mental health. What I've seen in the last 5 years, certainly even before the advent of cost of living, has been that the businesses are starting to focus more and more on people's financial well-being. And I'll explain why I think that's sort of happening, you know, in detail as we go through the presentation. There are three kind of areas I think I want to talk about today. One is kind of, we've talked about cost of living, cost of living crisis. What is the cost of living crisis, and how does that manifest itself from an employee perspective? And why do I think people are actually struggling? Because I think there are systemic issues underlying a lot of this as well, aside from the obvious kind of challenges that we have at the moment. And a more fundamental question is, why, as an employer, why should you care that, you know, your employees are struggling potentially, and what impact that might have on your business? And then thirdly, at the end, this has been touched upon already by some people this morning, how can you support employees? And the good news is it's not all about spending money. It can be a number of different simple steps that you can take from an employer's perspective to help support people. So when we talk about the cost of living crisis, what really are we actually talking about? Really, what we're actually talking about is inflation. So pretty much since 2008, inflation has been pretty much sub 2% in most sort of developed economies, and interest rates have been close to or just above zero up until, you know, maybe 12, 18 months or so ago, when concerns were starting to be expressed about, you know, about how economies were doing. So, you know, over the last year, over 2022 and into 2023, we've all experienced rising energy costs. So gas bills have gone up by, I think it's something like 96% over that period of time. Electricity bills have gone up by over 56%. Food inflation is currently running at over 16%. And of course, what that's meant is that the governments sort of around the world, not just in the UK, have had to step in to raise interest rates. And that in itself has had a massive impact on people's personal finances. So we know, for example, this year that over 1.5 million people in the UK will be coming off fixed rate interest rate deals, where potentially they might be paying 1.5% now and could be facing an increase to maybe 5 or 6%, depending on what they intend to do with their mortgages. In the real world, what this means, of course, is people's buying power in terms of their salaries has declined quite dramatically. So inflation even today is still running at over 10%. So, if you think about that from the most simplistic point of view, we all know when we go to the supermarket, I went out for my birthday on Saturday evening, went to a restaurant. I was genuinely quite shocked, actually, how expensive, not because the restaurant was particularly expensive, just the way in which prices have actually increased over the last sort of 12 months. So, of course, people are actually feeling that pinch. But I think actually underlying all of this is a much deeper issue, and I think it's more of a systemic issue. So when we're doing presentations to groups of employees or we're actually talking to people one-on-one, what we find is that people have a very low level of understanding of how to manage their personal finances. In fact, there were some statistics produced by Which last year that showed that 50% of people don't feel confident in terms of how they should manage their finances. And that's certainly reflected in my experience when we're talking to individuals about simple things that they can do to improve their financial outlook. They tend to struggle to understand how tax works, how national insurance works, to Ben's point, how their benefits work, what those benefits are, and what that provides for them in terms of support. But I think the other systemic issues that are actually there are, as a society, rightly or wrongly, we have high levels of personal debt. So, what that translates to is simple, even marginal small increases in interest rates have a huge impact potentially on individuals because they struggle to be able to cope with those sort of changes in their personal finances. And I think, as I said earlier, I think what we generally find is that people have quite low levels of resilience because they have low levels of savings, low levels of understanding of kind of how to help themselves in terms of improving their financial situation. When we talk to individuals about financial well-being, we have this framework called the 4 pillars. And the first 2 pillars of that framework is all about helping people understand simple things that they can do to budget, to create a kind of financial plan for themselves in terms of the way in which they can manage the money that they've got. We're not pretending that we can give them any more money, but what we can do is help them be better with what they got. And the second stage of that kind of process is helping them understand the way in which they can build an emergency fund to sort of cater for some of life's unexpected challenges that we all sort of face as we go through our everyday sort of being. I think I said earlier that, if we were having this conversation, 5 years ago, most businesses would have been very, very focused on mental well-being, quite rightly so. But the conversation has kind of moved on, I think, now. So when I'm talking to the businesses about financial well-being, quite often most HRDs that I'm speaking to or directors of those businesses kind of understand that there is a strong link between people's mental health and their financial well-being. So if you've got a workforce that is financially stressed or stressed generally, that will have a negative impact on your workforce. And I think it was Ben touched upon the idea of absenteeism. So typically where you have a workforce that has high levels of mental health issues, you tend to see organizations that have high degrees of presenteeism. So what I experience now when I talk to employers is there's a recognition that if they don't tackle the underlying problem of financial well-being, that's going to have an immediate knock-on effect to their workforce in terms of their mental well-being. A couple of quite staggering statistics, which I think, highlight that point quite well. Individuals with financial stress are 4 times more likely to have serious mental health issues with the negative impact that will have for the business. And they're also, more importantly, twice as likely to change jobs. And I know today's conversation is all around kind of cost of living and some of the challenges, and we're all experiencing this at the moment. But one point I would actually make is over the next year, 18 months, the economy will start to grow again, hopefully. We already know that lots of businesses are struggling to attract and retain people, particularly with certain skills in their businesses. So it's important to think about the here and now, but it's also more important perhaps to think about the long term in terms of the way in which you can explain to those employees the way in which you're going to support them, not only through the current crisis, but also through the next sort of 18 months. I said at the outset, not all support is necessarily involved in you spending more money. I think it was Jeremy made the point absolutely correctly that there's lots and lots of free resource out there around financial well-being. Mercer itself has a very, very good tool on its mercer.com website called the Financial Wellbeing Toolkit. This is free. You don't even have to be a client of Mercer. You can access that and your employees can access it. and it's got lots of free kind of collateral on there about ways in which people can get support and help. And as Jeremy said, and I think Ben mentioned as well, you know, signpost these things to people, make it known to your employees what support is actually out there. Ben highlighted a couple of examples that I would mention as well. You know, talk to your existing providers. You may have an EAP provider or a medical scheme provider, or even a pension provider. Many of these organizations will deliver free or very low cost kind of support to members. So rather than sort of thinking about how you can spend more money, think about how you can use what you're already doing to actually support people. And I think finally, if none of that is enough, think about potentially sort of repurposing the money that you currently spend. Employers spend in general quite a lot of money providing benefits to their employees. It's really, really important that employees understand what those benefits are and what benefits they give them. So if at the end of the day, you're not able to sort of access sort of free support, think about spending or repurposing a little bit of the budget that you actually already spend on benefits to offer sort of guidance and education sessions to members. Because I think you'll actually see, and we see when we talk to members, it's a really positively received approach from employers. And it does sort of reinforce the feeling that as an employer, you're supporting their employees. I'd just like now to hand back to Sharon, I believe, who's going to deal with any questions that may come in from people who've attended.
Yeah, so thank you very, very much to all of the speakers today. Just to have your knowledge and expertise has been invaluable. I've been writing notes as we've been going through myself as a business owner. So yeah, it's been really, really, well, personally for myself, well received. I'm sure for others that are listening today and others that will be on the recording listening to this session. But yes, so thank you very much from myself and the team here. We are opening the floor here to questions for people. So I don't know if anyone who is